Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my absolutely lovely and delightful co-host, Mackenzie. How are you, Mac?
I'm doing okay. As good as one does. Yeah, my sound quality went out to Glosian and got cholera for now, so we'll see how it goes.
It's fine. We still hear you perfectly well, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. So before we get started, as always, if you want to support the show, you can check out the recommended reading page. You could do a bit of a give what you like on PayPal, and you can check us out on Patreon. If you want to know more about that, you can stick around to the end of the show, and Mac gives an absolutely killer pitch about the extra stuff that we have going on over there. Today, we're going to be addressing an aspect that we've kind of touched upon on the periphery of most of our shows, mostly since the beginning, actually, and that's immigration. And specifically, we're going to be talking about planned migration. Through letters, we're going to be talking about it through philosophy, through public policy, and through poetry. So it's going to be a big episode today, but I think it all makes sense in the end.
It's an interesting episode, I gotta say. I'm looking at everything we're talking about. We touch on British law in the early 19th century. We touch on, reading letters and using that is always fascinating because it's a very common person type of view. I love reading journals, diaries, and letters. We talk on like Thanos-esque policy and philosophy. It's going to be great.
It's going to be a bumpy ride at sometimes, but I think we'll get through it. Just to bring this all in, when we say planned migration, right, we have this idea of immigration and migration as being something that people do almost out of necessity, or that they do on their own, right? But there was a whole movement, especially in the 19th century, and we're going to see why, about people being told to migrate or people being helped to migrate. And we kind of touched upon that in the Grosilla episode, where the Irish were paid to come to Canada by some landlords sometimes. And there's a whole program of sponsored immigration to Canada that we're going to be talking about today, and that's called the Petworth Emigration Scheme. And we're going to develop a bit the background for that before talking specifically about it, but that's what we're planning on doing today. Before we get started, just to kind of open up the discussion, Mac, what are your general ideas about how migration to or in Canada, how did that take place in your mind, or at least the way you typically imagine it, right? The reasons why, what kind of people came here, just to kind of get the ball rolling.
Honestly, if I'm looking at one of those, you're thinking of like keywords for countries. America has freedom, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all that.
Yeah.
Migration to me is a big part of Canada. There's always been lots of programs to move people around, lots of ideas of exploring frontier, wilderness. Migration has always been sort of, even nowadays, there's still lots of talk about taking in immigrants, the immigration policies of the country.
Totally.
It sits at, it's one of the cornerstones of what our nation stands for. Even if our literature, if you're looking at our literature, so many stories and books that we put into the Canadian lit canon and Canadian classics list are just about people who are moving to new places or have arrived to a new place.
Yeah, definitely. But you mentioned in passing, for example, the States. Do you think that there's a major difference between how we've approached immigration here compared to the United States? Or
yeah, I would say so. Over the years, or especially again, modern times, we can see it a bit more clearly with the big D who was in power. But even now, there's always going to be, I just find it's a much more big of a talking point for us. And there's a lot more discussion around whether there should or not be. Whereas in the States, I find it's very one extreme or the other.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I would have a tendency to say that while there are some issues with the way, this is looking at it, as you say, in the grand scheme of thing, that Canada has had some issues with its immigrants about specifically choosing what kinds of immigrants come in and what they should do or shouldn't do once they come in. But I think that the Canadian mindset has kind of developed into acknowledging, to varying degrees of success, that that these immigrants are, different cultures in their own right. Whereas, obviously we hear about the American melting pot mentality much more often, right? And this is just one of those clear differences that I think is worthy of mention here.
I think it's very interesting. And I think, honestly, I think a lot of that has to be owed to the fact, we make jokes, but the fact that we started with a French colony, and then there was a large British colony, and then they brought in their own immigrants, and it just built on from there. We never had the one set type of people that were just living here from the beginning, except for the First Nations, of course. We're all immigrants.
The idea also, I think, that we should know is that what we're going to be talking about today is, a specific kind of immigration that, yes, acknowledges some of what we're talking about, but also it works very much with this mentality of a specific type of people that we're looking for, right? And what I mean by that is that, yes, there are varieties of Scottish, Irish, English, but it's mostly staying within a European framework, right? And while there were other people from Asia and South America and Africa, all kinds of places, they were not as readily acknowledged, right? And so what we're going to be talking about today is mostly a British-centric thing, because that's deliberately what they were looking for in immigrants. Right? So,
just look at the Montreal flag that we have today. It's marked with the 4 flowers of Scotland, Ireland, Britain, and France.
Yes.
That's how specific and big the immigration impact that those countries had.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And part of it was deliberate, and part of it was just the fact that there were a lot of immigrants that initially came from those places, and it kind of begot a lot of more immigrants that came to visit their families and friends and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, okay, I think that's a good place to start. And if you want, if you're on board for that, Mac, I think we could actually start by talking a bit of the poetry that we mentioned at the start of the episode. This is specifically a poem written by a Scot who's called Alexander McLachlan. And he wrote a long poem called The Emigrant.
Jesus, it's long.
It's really long. And fun fact, the version you read was unfinished.
Of course it was.
He never actually finished the poem.
I read the introduction and a bit of chapter 1.
Yeah, that's fair. It does get a bit repetitive, so that's totally okay. And you absolutely get the gist that he's going for with this poem without reading the entire thing. But I think it's a good way to kind of open up to the way that emigration was talked about and what kind of mentality surrounded it. And from there, we can kind of talk about the actual policies, the Petworth Emigration Scheme, and a bit of the actual lived experiences of the immigrants who went through that process. By the way, throughout the episode, I'm going to be using migrant, emigrant, immigrant almost interchangeably, just because it's a question of perspective of where they come from, right? Emigrant is someone who leaves, immigrant is someone who comes in. It depends on where you come in. So I'll just be using them interchangeably because in this case, because we're talking on such a global scale, it doesn't really matter.
It's like emigrant is leaving, immigrant coming in, migrant moving within.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. I think migrant, we could almost just use migrant the entire time because you're just moving. But
from one British part of the Commonwealth to another British part of the Commonwealth.
It was the Empire at the time. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Granddad, you're still an empire. Good job.
That is totally a granddad thing to say, though. So anyway, just a bit on Alexander McLachlan himself.
Do you want to read part of this?
We can read a part of it. I just wanted to give a bit of context on who McLachlan was first, and then we're going to look into a bit of the poem. So McLachlan himself was an immigrant, and it's argued whether or not how much of his actual experience went into writing this poem. And you can debate that a bit, and you can certainly see some of his political views coming in to play. But in short, he was a Scottish immigrant who came to Upper Canada in 1840. he started off as a cotton factory worker and came into Upper Canada as a farmer on his father's farm, at least. And this kind of experience of being more of a working man did very much influence his mentality and his poetry. And he's actually, for that very reason, been called the Robert Burns of Canada, although that relation is tenuous at best. For those who don't know, Robert Burns is kind of Scotland's poet laureate.
Like the ultimate Scottish hero.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He was a wonderful poet, and
God.
he often wrote in the Scots dialect.
If you ever sang the song Old Lang Syne, that's a Robert Burns.
And as a kind of homage to the Scottish heritage of Canada, there is an actual Robert Burns Society in Montreal, and there's a statue erected to him and so on and so forth.
It was Robert
go
Burns Day, and every year at my boarding school, one of the teachers would stand up and make us sing Old Lang Syne on Robert Burns Day. He would wear a kilt, and he would have a bottle of whiskey with him.
No kidding. I've
And
never heard
take
of that.
this all in mind. This took place in a chapel. This Scotsman's there with his thick accent, holding a bottle of scotch in a kilt, singing Old Lang Syne.
Oh my God. I love that image so much. And it's just totally representative of everything that we're talking about right now. But yeah, Robert Burns was very much known as being a poet of the common man, I guess. He was very interested in people having a voice of their own, that it wasn't just those of the rich and powerful and of the aristocracy that we heard. And so that's why he was very interested in using the Scots dialect, for example, in his poems, because that was the speech of the more common person of Scotland, not the high English that the lords and ladies were talking. McLachlan is rather similar in that he does talk a lot about the backwoods pioneer, and he's Scottish, and that's pretty much where the relation ends, because he is far from being as competent a poet as Robert Burns is, but it's still an interesting comparison to make, and is definitely indicative of the kind of images that early Canadians, right in the 1830s and 40s, want to make of the relations that they have with the past. See, we are continuing these traditions that come from the old country and adapting them to Canada. And that's very much something that McLachlan is going to be concerned with, is, bringing good Scottish values to Canada, and in a way that's a bit proto-communistic. In a sense, it's very interesting in the sense of very much
Scottish values.
In the sense of, very much being focused on the community, and very much people being hard workers and getting the credit they deserve, not everything going to the lords and ladies.
That's pretty Scottish, yeah.
I mean, it's also just values that should be kind of, getting your due, and not that should be international, but that's another issue. That's stuff that
That's the American
McLachlan,
dream, isn't it?
yeah, that's kind of the American dream. But yeah, that's kind of a basic overview of who McLachlan was. That being said, so the Emigrant, so it's a long poem. I think in total it's something like 200 pages long. It's long, it's interesting, but I totally understand if people don't want to read the entirety of it. If you want to read it all, I'll put a link to it in the description. But in short, it was meant as an attempt to sketch the history of a backwoods settlement through the eyes of someone coming into Canada.
You just read the introduction, honestly, and it gives you the grand gist of things, good and bad.
Yeah, how about we start there? How about we just start at the introduction and give us your kind of initial thoughts as to what this poem does for you, what it represents, and what we kind of gather from McLachlan's own ideas.
Well, first off, the very beginning, I like how it just lists winter, because he goes through his first 4 or 5 lines are land of mighty lake and frost, where the winter's locks are hoarest, where the summer's leaf is greenest, and the winter's bite the keenest, where the autumn's leaf is searest. I like how he just lists winter twice and no spring.
Right?
If that isn't Canadian.
Absolutely. It's just a focus on the fact that 6 months a year we have just
it's cold,
snow and cold. Doing a quick search of the poem, I think spring in the entire thing is mentioned like 5 times. But we were actually talking about this before, right? Of this idea, it's kind of interesting that spring as this typical image of rebirth is not mentioned more often in a poem about coming to a new place and, starting a new life. It seems like a really obvious theme, but no.
It's very much just sort of Canada doesn't get reborn. It just keeps on going. It just keeps on trucking. No, but that's what we do. Even when we confederated, it wasn't like it was some sort of massive rebirth. We just sort of cut ourselves away and we just sort of kept doing what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. There's a bit more nuance to that, but we'll get to it eventually.
Oh, of course. Obviously, there's a lot more like complexity and nuance. But you get, we didn't have a revolution, did we?
No, exactly. Or at least we had one that lasted for like a few months, and then
not the rebellions again, please.
No, we're not going to talk about the rebellions again. Well, that's not true. We are going to talk about them, but in passing.
Oh, God.
No, but...
And then on countless worlds, Mackenzie wept. For the rebellions, we're still alive. Oh.
But actually going off of that idea, I think I can kind of continue on in the introduction of the Emigrant. There's at the end of the first stanza and the beginning of the second one, right? So there's this kind of idea that McLachlan is going for where he's kind of trying to find poetry everywhere, right? And really absorbing in the environment and this whole history. Every little thing gets mentioned, every little branch and tree and bird that doesn't quite sound exactly as it should to his ears is mentioned. And that's kind of embodied right in the first stanza, right? For example, at the end of the first one, we get, "And the eagle is careering, where the gentle deer are bounding, and the woodsman axe resounding. Land of mighty lake and river, to our hearts thou art dear forever."
Yeah, and I also like that you read those lines because it's really interesting because he's building on this sort of the nature, the animals, and then he includes the woodsman sort of as if tying it back to nature, as if this isn't sort of a human thing. This is all just, again, part of nature, even the woodsman.
However, it is interesting, and this will kind of lead us into, this will be interesting to touch on again later. He's specifically mentioning someone who is altering nature, though. A woodsman's axe resounding, right? So yes, he's mentioning nature, but it's someone who's taking control of it and someone who has to actually work for what he's trying to build in Canada.
But the emphasis is on the sound.
Yes.
It's on the sensory, not the sort of construction. And he's intertwining it really well. He's sort of finding this way to sort of intertwine this sort of trying to build this deep connection to the land.
What I find very interesting is that right in the second stanza, he kind of goes against the end of the first one, right? Where the first one kind of touched upon this idea of poetry everywhere, and there's beauty and there's things to do and actual work to be done, and it opens up to the potential of this relatively new colony, right? Or this colony that has a lot of things to do. And immediately in the second stanza, he mentions, "Thou art not a land of story, thou art not a land of glory, no tradition, tale, nor song to thine ancient woods belong."
Right.
It kind of contradicts what he's saying, in a sense. Well, at least I find.
Maybe a little bit. Maybe I sort of see it like in the first stanza, he said he's setting up this grand canvas of what Canada is, and then the second one, he opens saying, "This is a place where we can create. We can create this land of story, land of glory." I can see where your contradiction, but I sort of read it as it's a place where we can build. Like, this is a blank slate for us to do something wonderful. This doesn't have any sort of past or history that we have to contend with, for example.
Interesting, yeah. Or at least he chooses not to contend with that past.
As we know now, that is completely false. We can have to contend with the past and the history of the First Nations people. But let's not talk about that. Let's just forget about them first, I guess. God.
For now, and that's kind of why I wanted to touch upon these poems first, is that next episode we're pretty much going to be talking about the treaties. and how they're intrinsically tied to what we're talking about here, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, one of the notes that I took down, and I don't know if you noticed this in your reading of it, is that while there are mentions of woodsmen and stuff like that we mentioned, there does seem to be a lacking human element to the Emigrant, surprisingly enough, for someone with the views that McLachlan had.
Well, I find it interesting because wherever we see a human element, he almost strips it of a humanity. So, like, human nature can be seen here within the forest green. Let us wander where we will. There's a world of good and ill. So he's almost stripping away our common ideas of human civilization, all that, just to say human nature exists of us just wandering.
There's that. And also just, I think probably the idea of being able to start anew. I don't think we can necessarily ignore the more simple idea of, this is an ocean away, right? You can actually completely strip away what you were before and start anew as a farmer, where before you were a cotton worker in a mill, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's like he says, yet heroic deeds are done where no battles lost or won, in the cottages, in the woods, in the lonely solitudes. We're still creating heroes. It's just we're not doing it the old-fashioned way of, this doesn't have to be a place where heroes are made through war, battle, bloodshed. Heroes can be made from a new path. He wants to create a new way of doing things.
Yeah, one last thing that I wrote down, and you can add some other stuff after, but one last thing that I noted, I wrote down in my notes, expectation versus actuality or reality. And this idea of, we've kind of mentioned a few passages here and there, and we can keep going, but it's a very exaggerated view, right? This is a grand view of Upper Canada and everything that McLachlan sees, right? But this is not necessarily a lived experience as people would have actually experienced it, right? This is, people would have gone off of ships that took many weeks to get here. They would have actually had to toiled for quite some time in order to get a reasonable living and a reasonable wage. There's all kinds of things that aren't necessarily mentioned in favor of a grand and beautiful idea of Canada. And I think that's an interesting point to raise up right now, because it's going to follow us later, is expectation versus reality, or promise versus reality.
I mean, so McLachlan's painting a very nice picture, and it as of this beautiful, what's the phrase, tabula rasa, I think it is, blank slate.
Yeah.
The reality is at this point, there's a couple hundred years of colonists already living there, both France and the English, and then not to mention the thousands of years of First Nations tribes that have been living there, that have also been waging war and doing battle, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
There's the fact that battle of the Plains of Abraham. There was a whole war in the 7 Years' War that happened here between the British and the French. This isn't the blank slate he's painting it as. The reality situation of the history is very, very different.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's absolutely that. And it's interesting that, and that kind of comes back to this idea of what we were mentioning earlier of there's no land of story, there's no tradition or tale or song, but I almost wonder if he's just not thinking about that history itself, and he's thinking of, again, keeping the little people in mind, right? The small people have no history when they come here, the commoners. I don't know what his intention was that one, but in that case it would make sense. But in general, I would definitely agree with you that he kind of ignores those major moments that did happen.
And I feel like a lot of the commoners would resonate. Like, what year was this? Was this poem released in?
In the 1860s, if I remember correctly. 1861, yeah.
So that's a total discredit to, I'm sure, a lot of the common people, French colonists, that would have resonated with their own sort of plight or whatever.
Absolutely.
The commoners of France that would be looked down upon as the little people.
Yeah. And just think about it. When you imagine, like, yes, there was a lot that was unsettled in Canada, but this is 6 years before Confederation. Like, Canada's on the verge of becoming a state in and of itself with a vibrant society that's all on its own, or at least that it deems like worthy enough of having a nation state, right? And this guy comes along, he's like, nah, but still.
There's no culture here. This is a blank slate. Never mind the good old war of 1812, the rebellions of the 1830s in France, the everything. It's fine. It's all fine. That's nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. But he does mention, though, however, later on in chapter 1, something that might be redeeming and a bit on that human element that I think is lacking of the poem, but this is part 6 of chapter 1. He said, I've seen in 70 years and 10 so many strange mutations, so many sides of fortune's face to families and nations. I've learned to know she can't be caught by whip, by spur. So he is noting some changes, but it's a bit late, I find, or at least it's not getting as much play
for sure.
as...
Like, the way he's writing this, it almost like it makes him seem like he's one of the first settlers in Canada, when in reality he's showing up at the 11th hour and he's saying, when do we get the party started? Meanwhile, John A. MacDonald's already dominating the beer pong table.
But yeah, that's just a kind of introduction to the Emigrant. We can come back to it, but unless you had something else specific that you think can open up to this idea of immigration specifically, right? Or at least the mentality that people have of immigrants and the reality that they're coming into in Canada, I think we can go on to a bit more of the historical part and come back to the letters and poems later.
Honestly, my last thought that just popped in my head.
Yeah.
This guy is writing as a man who does not know the commoner immigrant. Like, they would not have, it's a bit of a piece of work, to sort of come in and assert this lifestyle when in reality they're probably living horrible lives, to assert that you're the one who has the best interest of the common man.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's very little that I know about his actual life, but he doesn't seem like someone who really had that at heart, indeed. It seems a bit disingenuous. With that being said, how about we go on to a bit of the ideas that were circulating around in the so-called mother country, right, in England, because we're going to have to talk, when we talk immigration policy, it's intrinsically tied to what's going on in England, right? Canada is not really making its own immigration policy just yet. It's mostly dictated by what happens in England.
At this point, we're just used to England telling us, you're going to accept the immigrants, and we go, okay, we're just going to keep accepting immigrants.
Yep, that's just the way it's going to be, I guess. And to kick things off, we do need to talk a bit about philosophy, or at least a philosophical idea that today can really appear to be rather sketchy, but does have a historical foundation that makes sense to an extent.
Oh yeah, we're talking about Thanos right now. Like, legitimately, we're talking about like the original guy of Thanos.
Yeah. So for those who, obviously we're going to be talking about a guy called Thomas Malthus and his philosophy that's come to be known as Malthusianism, which, as Mackenzie says, is pretty much the idea that Thanos was expounding in the...
And for those who don't know, that means controlling the population, the acknowledgement that we have limited resources, and that the best way to correct it or to fix this problem was through extreme population control.
Yeah. Malthus was writing this in the late 18th century. I think the treatise in which he wrote this came out in 1778, if I remember correctly. And so this was right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, right? That was really taking a full swing in places like England and Western Europe. And today we look at it and we're like, oh, well, you can look at it from a perspective of increased production and the ability to, actually produce things on a wider scale from access to more people, and things are cheaper. There are certain elements that are positive. However, it does come with a downside that people were not necessarily considering, or if they considered, did not take the right meaning from, right?
It's just if you take a look at the checks he wants to put in, it's a lot of restrictions. He also has the like positive checks. And you want to know what the positive checks are for Malthusianism? Disease, starvation, and war. Things that he believed were just going to solve the problem of overpopulation and the strain to put on our resources.
These were the things, if I remember correctly, these were the things he thought would naturally take care of it.
Yeah.
Basically, there are other checks that he does put in that are basically social limitations, but specifically for the poor, because Malthus pretty much, he has an initial idea that's not too dissimilar to Darwinism in a sense, or what we would now consider like social Darwinism, in the sense of if you help the poor too much, they'll just keep being poor and they're going to continue to exist in society. Whereas if we limit the poor's ability to breed, if we limit the poor's ability to receive help and stuff like that, it'll force them out of their situation, or it will kind of ease them out of the existence of society, and everyone will kind of be all the better for it. This is wrong, by the way. I must point out, like, do not do that, please. The socialist inside me is absolutely screaming at this, but that's his idea.
Just let poor people die. It's not like they were born into destitution and that they had no control over their living circumstances when they were born. It was a choice. They're just not working hard enough. And yeah, exactly. And again, coming back to this idea of the Industrial Revolution, right? This is completely ignoring the realities of what increased mechanization does. And that is, it to an extent, it does put people out of jobs, right? But they didn't put in the necessary social circumstances to allow them to find other jobs or different jobs within society, right? Or allow them to live off of something else that was replaced by mechanization. So you just ended up with a bunch of people who, like farmers, for example, suddenly had machine thrashers and, mine workers who were getting absolutely piss poor wages, but who suddenly couldn't even make that because a lot of machines were taking their jobs, literally, and there was nothing for them. Yeah.
I mean, you laugh, but that's really it.
I know, no, I'm laughing because of South Park, because of the guys in the town who are always just like, they took your jobs.
Probably for different reasons. I didn't see that episode of South Park, but I have a sneaking suspicion that, knowing them, they're probably talking about immigrants or something like that.
Yeah, they do. And they talk about technology also removing them from their jobs.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too deeply into Malthusianism just because it gets kind of boring.
It's also just kind of wrong.
Yes.
So speaking earlier, I mean, his positive checks, as he calls them, of disease, starvation, and war, we just look at population graphs and we can prove those wrong. When war happens afterwards, there's a baby boom. Same with disease, starvation, aftermath, disasters, and crises. Lots of babies get born and then the population returns to normal. You would need a disease on the level of the Black Plague to make a proper dent.
People find new hopes after these traumatic events. They don't just accept their fate, right? But as you were saying, it's wrong. Like, Malthusianism doesn't actually make sense, or at least it only makes sense within a specific, very, very specific framework.
His solutions don't make sense, but his ideas do. Like, we are overpopulated and we are limited on our resources. But it's when he gets into trying to fix the problem that it all just...
He's also operating under a mindset of, well, people won't have enough to eat excessively, right? He's thinking in a very capitalist way of overproducing and being able to eat a lot on the levels that were being produced thanks to the Industrial Revolution. So he's like, see, if we have all this overpopulation, we won't be able to reap the benefits, everyone, of this overproduction. But if you don't have the overproduction in the first place, you still will survive and people will still be able to eat, right? It's just he's putting the checks in the wrong place. The reason why I wanted to introduce Malthusianism is not because my little socialist heart wanted to rail against something this episode. It's because it genuinely had an impact on British policy. Mostly because they were in the same situation as Malthus. They were like, well, of course, we won't have this excess, so we have to cut somewhere. And if we're going to cut somewhere, it's not from us. It has to be from the bottom.
And this whole idea of, we can we can help the poor while only really helping ourselves and still look good doing it.
A change in British social policy comes in the 1830s, so about 50 years or 60 years after Malthus's writing. I think he's dead by now, but basically what happens is that these industrial advancements really reach a boiling point in England, and especially in the south of the United Kingdom, where it's much more agricultural at the time, and people are really feeling the effects of mechanization much more. And so you'll have in 1830 what's called the swing riots, in which basically people, and mostly agricultural workers and farmers, are going to be rioting against the fact that they are not making enough money, that they are not making a living wage. And you see in the streets people straight up attacking, like, not a combine, but like thrashers. They are literally dismantling machines that are, as you said so succinctly, stealing their jobs.
Seize the means of production.
Kind of, yeah. It's a radical way of doing that, yeah. What will happen basically after this riot is a revamping of what was called the British Poor Law, right? And this happens in 1832. In essence, it follows Malthus's ideas and tries to put them into practice, into law.
2 out of 10 wouldn't recommend doing it again. It's the equivalent of saying, we're facing a pandemic. I'm just going to give $1,200 to everybody and let them figure it out from there.
Yep.
It's like, wow, would somebody ever be so stupid to do that?
Nope. Don't know who you're talking about. Anyway, basically what happens with the new poor law in relation to the poor, or what is considered by the government to be a poor person, there is essentially less eligibility for help, and there's what's called a workhouse test. In short, it's decided that you really have to be a completely destitute person with no chances of getting possible work or new work in order to receive help. You have to be tantamount to an out-of-work independent laborer to get. The second one is called the workhouse test, which the workhouses are put into place around this time, and the name is pretty self-explanatory. It's just places where we put poor people to work on various projects. And if you work outside of the workhouses and you are poor and destitute, you cannot really get any help, right? So you only can get help if you need it, or at least if you're judged to absolutely need it, and you work within that workhouse. What this does basically is, as we mentioned it, this mostly affects much of the rural and agricultural regions of England, right, of the United Kingdom, and that includes the South, which is where we will start to get into places like Petworth.
You're talking there, and the idea of them having to live in the worker camps is basically what they were, to reap the benefits. It reminds me of a certain policy in a certain country where a certain group of people have to live on their reserves just to reap the benefits given to them for the fact that they were genocided. And they can't leave to have a better life. They have to stay on their specific reserves. Sounds a little familiar, don't you think?
That sounds extremely familiar, and is an excellent point to bring up that I legitimately did not think about at first, but it's a very great comparison to make, and one that's especially going to be helpful when thinking about next episode.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's that. There's the fact that the rent thing. You explained the rent thing. The idea of how to help people with their rent. So basically, in the British Poor Law, there was a provision where they would give out aid to people who qualified to help with certain things. And so it was noted that it was most likely just going to be to help with paying for their boarding houses and their living arrangements. So basically, they were going to help them pay for their rent by supplementing, giving them half of it. They didn't reduce the rent in general. They said, we're going to help you pay for part of it. When it seems to me a much easier solution that wouldn't cost the British taxpayer a single penny was just reduce rent in general, and then the relief money that you have can go to necessities such as food and water and drink.
You would think so, but that seems like an overly simple solution for a state that was basing itself on completely erroneous ideas. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's definitely a great interjection. I should have written it down, but
just to say, these are all a bunch of reasons why people wanted to leave and migrate to somewhere else at the time, even with the risks of not knowing where they were going, the risks of disease, the risks of, I mean, it was a pound apiece at this point if they were going to die. They'd die if they stayed in Britain, die if they stayed in Canada. At least Canada would be an adventure to death instead of a slow march.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, this is kind of where Petworth comes in, and especially assisted immigration, because you do say a pound, but a lot of these people didn't really have that pound to spend in the first place, right? The most destitute actually, they were prioritizing survival over, saving up as much as possible to get out. And this is where
For sure.
Assisted migration comes in. So Petworth is a city or town at the time in Sussex, in the Sussex region of the United Kingdom of England. Petworth would kind of go against, or at least the parish of Petworth and the lord that watched over Petworth would kind of go against the grain of what the British Poor Law put into place. Because what the British Poor Law does is it mostly removes power from these local parishes and regions that had tended to be the providers of help for their communities, right? You often got help through the church, right? Say what you will about it. That's one of the major things that kept them around for so long, is their ability to help the poor through their own little system of taxation with the tithes and so on and so forth, which had its downfalls, but it definitely did help some people. And the British Poor Law of 1832 will kind of remove that. And instead, it centralized the ability to help people into a free market oriented system in London that was basically led by 3 commissioners that went around with their sub-commissioners throughout England to make sure that their laws were put into place and help transition them into this new system.
Got to keep those oppressed people oppressed,
Yeah. It's
bad for business otherwise.
I'm almost curious to know how much of it was them legitimately thinking that they were helping them. I think a lot of them do genuinely think, because we have to think that this was a relatively new idea, right? This idea of free market systems and this idea of Malthusianism and social Darwinism were relatively new ideas. They hadn't been tested out on such a large scale yet. And I'm genuinely curious how much of it was genuine interest in seeing that if this could work. Ultimately, it doesn't really, and that's where we get where we are. But I'm genuinely curious how much of them were actually, had good intentions.
I think their belief with this system was it was a way for them, they thought it would be a way for them to help without having to give up anything of their own. So that's why they wanted to try it and push for it so hard. There was this idea of, oh, we can make this work, help the poor, and then keep our own money, and everything will be fine.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Petworth itself, we're talking about it because what will happen in the early 1830s, right around the time when this law is put into place, is the formation of what was called the Petworth Emigration Committee, right, which would start off its own little scheme of assisted migration. So the 2 main people that we're going to be talking about in this case is George Wyndham, who was the 3rd Earl of Egremont, basically the lord who was looking over most of the lands of Sussex, including Petworth, and his personal chaplain, Thomas Socket, who was a rector in Petworth, an Anglican rector. The 2 were quite close. Basically, Thomas Socket was very much involved in the education of Egremont's children. He was, as we mentioned, his personal chaplain. Their faith was intertwined and their beliefs were very similar. And part of this belief was that they were Tories. We've talked about Tories before, and a big part of that ideology is a kind of paternalism, right, which believes that even if it's condescending in nature, that they should overtly help people, right? And Egremont, I do genuinely think he had good intentions for all intents and purposes. He was a good guy. Like he does seem like someone who had people's interests at heart to an extent. But this idea of paternalism does come into play, right? Egremont actually apparently did allow a lot of the lower class to visit his mansions at times, and he did actually finance a lot of artistic endeavors. He was not unaffected by this idea of Malthusianism that did permeate British society. And while he did resist the commissioners that came knocking at his estates, he still recognized that there was an issue with land, wealth, and food distribution in his country, right? And especially in the land that he was living in. The difference is he actually decides to do something different about it, all the while keeping a maximizing of profits in mind. Because why not? Why wouldn't he? Of course he does.
It sounds like Walt Disney. Sounds like the Disney Corporation. Oh, we're going to help out. Legitimate. We're going to help out these poor kids by bringing them to Disney World for a trip, but we're still going to maximize our profits.
Yeah, of course. I mean, ultimately, he has land and Disney has their parks and whatever, and they want to make money off of it. That's the point of a business, right? Is to make money off of it.
Yeah.
There is a difference in how you go about it and the intent behind it.
Then there's the point of humanity.
To survive and, thrive, surprisingly enough.
And be humane.
Yeah. So what he'll do basically is he'll get together Egremont with Thomas Socket, and they'll decide, okay, we're going to help a lot of these people, right, in our community to go to Canada. They have plenty of room, right? We have the money to help them through various means. And, not only will it help them, but it'll clear up a lot of the land that, in this case, Egremont owned in order to maximize its efficiency, right? You don't have to spread the wealth to more and more people. Instead, you can spread it to less people and send the others to make their money elsewhere. And ultimately, the expense of sending them to Canada is going to be nothing compared to how much money you will make off of the land if there are less people. So he's going at it with this mindset. The way that it was divided between the committee itself, mostly through that was headed by Egremont, and the parish, was that Egremont and his men would manage to charter the ships, provide supplies, and hire basically superintendents for the ships. And the parish would take care of clothing the poor, the actual trip, the actual voyage within Canada, and paying the necessary personnel on the ship, and the actual settlement in Canada, right? So they didn't just leave them to their own devices once they got at the port of Quebec City, right? They actually made sure that they could stay there.
Which is altogether not a bad plan, honestly. Like, good on him for that.
There's some shady stuff, but it's, as you say, it's the best of a bad situation, I would say, in this case. So a lot of the money, right, or at least this scheme, this immigration scheme as it's called sometimes, went to sending people from England to Upper Canada, and specifically to the rural regions of Upper Canada. They often passed through Toronto because that's where their connections were, but a lot of them were sent to the more western parts of Upper Canada, mostly because the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada basically was a connection of Egremont and Socket, and was on board with similar ideas, right? He encouraged assisted immigration for slightly different reasons. He wanted to make a profit, of course, but he also, and this comes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the episode, he deliberately wanted to settle the land with specifically British migrants, right? So as to counterbalance the westward moving Americans to the south. So there was a racial element here that we can't, or at least a perceived racial element that we can't really, or that we have to mention. So Lord John Colborne, who was Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, said, okay, Egremont, send me these people, get them here to Toronto, and from there we'll send them out to a variety of households that are already established and that can accommodate these people. Basically, they'll work off their debt and make a bit of money. And with that money that they make here, working for people, they will be able to buy their own land and settle. That was the general gist of it. And so from 1832 to 1837, there is about a 5-year period where about 1,800 people were going to be sent to Upper Canada through the Petworth Emigration Committee specifically. So this is where a lot of the interest in this project comes from, at least in the last few years. And a lot of the books that I've used for the research of this episode was kind of insightful is that a lot of the people were just very well and properly integrated in the conventional sense that we would imagine it. Like, they didn't stand out more than anything else. We've talked about Susanna Moody, right? Or before on the show, namely in the last episode, in the first episode, as this kind of middle-class settler who really stood out among the others. That wasn't quite the case with the people from Petworth. They were already much poorer. They didn't stand out. They were very much a common person, right? Much like McLachlan was talking about in his poems, or at least trying to talk about with his poems. And that's why we wanted to use letters for this episode as the main literary device, because their firsthand voices are pretty much what we have left of them. Nobody really wrote about them. Nobody really noticed them beyond the fact that they were now workers in Canada. They were people that allowed Canadians, or at least the territory that would become Canada, that allowed it to move west. So they're kind of the forgotten people that actually had a huge impact on Canada's society, or at least in the grand scheme of things, right? As settlers who came to the west, or increasingly to the west. So is there anything that you want to mention specifically about the Petworth Emigration Scheme before we move on to the letters themselves?
I mean, massive respect to the project for working to get these tales and letters back into the public eye.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really interesting thing. I can't imagine how long it would have taken. I'm sure someone has. Yeah, I'm sure it's written somewhere, and I didn't pay attention, but it must have been quite a project, and one that I appreciate quite profoundly. It's one of those things that kind of flies into the face, or not necessarily flies into the face, but does undermine a bit this winner's side of history. Right? This is a social history that I think is very much underappreciated, and I always like that kind of thing. So the book I'm referring to, or at least that Mac and I are referring to, where we found these letters, is called English Immigrant Voices. And it specifically focuses on people that were part of the immigration scheme. And we selected 4 letters that we're basically going to be talking about, because we can't talk about all of them. There are 160 or so in the entire collection. Yeah, we chose some, or at least I chose some from 1832 and 1837, so at the beginning and end of the project. That being said, Mac, do you have any initial thoughts about these letters? Like, what do they tell us about the lived experience of these immigrants?
I really do think they're fascinating. They're the most fascinating thing, just in how they, just for what they tell us. It's incredible, how different it is than what we would have thought.
How so?
Well, for the big one, the biggest thing for me, we were talking about it before, he's there and he's talking about the fact that the Indians, he was told the Indians would be wild and they would be savages, as they were told in the propaganda. But he's there and he says, I met some pretty nice people all around, pretty good, pretty cool, pretty chill. It was nice. Yeah. I just find that fascinating. It is from, I think it's Worsfold.
Do you want to read a little section that you were mentioning?
Yeah, I'll read the little section. I have not yet seen the wild Indians you told me of, but I have seen the Indians, but they are a different kind of people to what you expect they are. A very good sort of people. And Farron's kind of people, so what you expect they are, and it bears a much better name than the wild men and are very honest people.
Surprising as it may seem, the propaganda was not correct.
Oh my God. Or it's the same with the animals, as he says right below it. As for wild animals, I have seen but few. There are some bears in the wild parts of it and a few wolves, but they are shy. These apex predators are just like, no, we don't want to talk to you. Sorry, bye.
So it's a much more realistic outlook, surprising as it may seem, on life in Upper Canada at this time.
It's not as hostile as it was made out to be.
However, there is a certain hostility that does come through, especially, I think, in these earlier ones, in these early letters that we pointed out. So, for example, if we look at the very first letter that I sent to you, the one by Stephen Gocher. And by the way, yes. I'll try to put these letters in the description on the website as well, by the way. So if you want to read them yourselves, they're great. And we're going to try to read little sections here and there as we go along. But, there is definitely, there's mentions of cholera, right? There is that danger that they were aware of. And right around 1832, when he was writing this, that's when the cholera outbreak was happening in Canada, right? So there is this awareness of fear. This is on the second page of the Gaucher letter, in which he says, "We are now arrived in the woods, but what we are to do, we do not know at present. The mosquitoes are very troublesome. I think of having some land, but it is not settled at present. The land is very good." So there is this emptiness that you get with the Alexander McLachlan poem, right? The woods, these grand spaces. But the focus is specifically on what can you do with these woods and what are we going to do to survive in them, right? There is a profound awareness by these people, which again, I don't know how much of this was an expectation coming in or, a promise that was made to them before they arrived. It's like, there is a genuine expectation that this is going to be hard and occasionally very troublesome work, right? There is a fear to be had in these situations. And there was another section that I wanted to mention that does tie into what I just said at the very end of that same letter, where he says, "I cannot tell you where to write to me at present."
Yeah.
That
You see that in a couple of the letters.
Yeah.
People are just moving all over the place. I think it's the one with the wife who lost her husband or whatever, and she says, "Come to this town and ask around for me, and then you'll find me, and you'll see it's a really nice little town. I'm not in such and such place anymore."
It's not just that people are moving around, but the idea of, and this is more of a literary criticism from Northrop Frye, is like this idea of where is here does permeate in so many facets of Canadian literature. This idea of not really knowing where you're going to end up in the end, or this idea of not being fully aware of the full potential and vastness of movement and space and place that Upper Canada offers, right? Which I find fascinating. Again, but all in all, these letters are indicative of a much greater sense of hope than I would have initially expected. When I was first starting to read them, I was expecting people who had really hard lives and who, didn't know what to do. They were lamenting the fact that they should have, they maybe could have had a better life had they gone back home, much like we've seen many times, as I mentioned with Susanna Moody. That's the first thing that she mentions, is like, damn it, why did I leave England? But these people are happy in a sense, like they're aware that it's rough, but they are happy to have come here.
What's the awareness that it'd be rough wherever you go, so might as well keep going. It's a very real look at things. I like how they were talking about the pricing and everything. There's a special mention for the beer, the price of the beer.
Oh yeah,
that's always going to be the priority.
Which letter is that one?
Oh my god, I think it's Worsfold again.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, because he talks about pricing a lot, and I find it really fascinating. He seems the most hopeful, being like, "Oh, things are so much cheaper here. It's really nice."
It's also interesting. I do want to note that, I don't know if you looked at who these people were before leaving.
I read a little bit of their introductions.
So a lot of them were farmers and came to Canada to be servants or farmers or farmhands on pre-established farms, like I mentioned, right? But you mentioned John Worsfold, and he's an artist. He's a painter, right, and decorator. He's someone that doesn't really fit the mold of this hardworking, or at least this image of the hardworking and solid immigrant that's prepared for a life in the bush.
You look at Stephen Gaucher, who was he was a farmer who then became a constable, and then he was a superintendent on the boat.
It comes back to this malleability that you were mentioning, or this movement in a different kind of sense that you were.
Yeah.
I really.
These people they were just like, oh, let's just do the job and it'll work out.
It'll lead to a better life in the end. That's the whole point.
True spirit and grit right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the major takeaway from this one. Something that I do want to mention, however, because I think it is important in this case to compare, or at least analyze the differences between what McLachlan was doing and what the lived reality of these people represents. Because there are significant differences. Right? One of them is poetic and grand, and the other one is much more grounded and down to earth, as we've been talking about. One of the things that I kind of want to start off with is the similarities between the two. And I think that major similarity comes with how the land is perceived. The question of uninhabited space, emptiness, and the sense of modification is so associated with images of the land, is so associated with images of potential and absolute desire to conquer the land, that I can't ignore the fact that they exist in both, regardless of the approach that they take. Right? It permeates every single letter that we're reading about people that come to this new place and take control of the new life in a foreign land, but that brave the harsh and tall trees and endless forests to modify it into home.
That's manifest destiny at its greatest. This was the dreams of the people. And you see it reflected again in these letters. They weren't exactly coming into a blank slate of a location, but it wasn't an easy place either. Like, the place was colonized, but it hadn't been domesticated. They were still figuring things out themselves.
Do you find that there's a difference? And I wrote this down, and I don't know if I have an answer for this. Do you think that there's a difference between the type of immigration that McLachlan did, which is a much more individual and deliberate migration, versus the sponsored type that these people from the Petworth Migration Project did, right? Did you feel there was a difference between the expectations, between how people lived it? Like, what's your take on that?
For sure. I mean, for McLachlan to be there saying he wants to speak of good Scottish values, including community, the Petworth Project is they're the ones who had the community in mind. And you can see that in the writing. You can see that in the way they set things up. There seemed like there was some sort of support system in place. And he was just preaching. Petworth was practicing what they preached.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny that McLachlan was preaching, but from 30 years after the Petworth Project was done. It's like he's again late to the party in this case.
You guys, we need to come together as a community to help immigration. Petworth Project's already there, like making the chips and salsa and everything, making all the foods. Like, yeah, we know. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. What my initial thought, right, was I would have expected, right, and I was proven wrong, by the way, about this. I would have expected McLachlan to be a bit more of a person who emphasized this idea of, I did it my way. I really pulled through and did it on my own. No one told me what to do, and I came here and made a new life for myself, right, alone. Whereas, the rhetoric around these sponsored migrations of like, well, you helped people and so on and so forth. And you kind of touched upon this with McLachlan's own view of, social help and this idea of community. It didn't really come through as that at all in either of them. The idea of needing to work came through, but never quite this idea of being owed something or being better than another, depending on how you came here. We're all here, and we need to make the best of the situation.
Very Canadian value, if I do say so.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say that's certainly something that has permeated into a lot of the mindset of people coming here. Definitely. Now, I wrote this question down, and as we've been talking, I feel that we've kind of touched upon this, but I'm curious if you have a different take on it than me. But what do you think McLachlan's poem Aim was? Would you put this in a similar category as propaganda in a sense?
I think so. Not like political, but it was more just McLachlan's personal propaganda.
Definitely.
It wasn't like he was trying to be like part of some big movement. He was just trying to push his own personal values.
Yeah, I would say that in a sense, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad type of propaganda in this case. Although it did have its downsides. This idea of community does permeate as well in the letters, as you're saying. This aim does permeate in the letters in a sense. I wrote this down. There's a lot of emphasis in the variety of letters that we mentioned in all of them, that this idea of doing it for the family, for a specific cause, right? I'm doing this to leave a better life for my children, or to be able to send money to them back home for those who couldn't make it to Upper Canada in the first place. There was a specific aim, and while they weren't using the letters in the same way that McLachlan was using the poems, there was definitely an intent behind this kind of action that is not too dissimilar.
Honestly, I think if you're going to read one thing that we've talked about today, it should be the letters.
Okay.
Letters are always the best way to learn the common thoughts of the common person's thoughts. McLachlan's nice, the poetry is nice, but if you really want to get an idea of what was going on, the letters are the best place to go.
What value would you say that McLachlan's poetry has, outside of a literary one, obviously?
It has value in the idea of how a foreigner would perceive Canada. Coming in, this is what people at the time would have perceived of Canada. And in a lot of ways, it's still what people would perceive of Canada. You talk to people and you tell them you're from Canada, and they have similar thoughts that McLachlan does, that it's all just forests and other things like this. And it's yeah, there's still a lot of forests, but that's only if you go farther north. It's pretty we are a fully developed nation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
We do not live in igloos and have pet polar bears.
You laugh, but my grandfather, I don't know if I've told this story on the show before. My grandfather, when he was still alive, used to work at the customs agency in the Eastern Townships near Morse's Line, right on the Vermont border.
Yep, I follow.
He had Americans come up sometimes, and Vermont is not far from Canada, obviously. It's literally on the border. And he had people come up in the summer with skis, thinking that they could come ski as soon as they entered Canada, even though it was July. And you're like, no, we don't actually all live in perpetual snow. Mm-hmm. And these ideas stick with people. And it's in part due to the kind of things that, as you're saying, McLachlan does expound. So yeah, I think that's a very, very good point that you bring up. Of McLachlan is a very interesting case study of how these ideas are perpetuated and how they've been much longer lasting, or at least where they come from in the first place. Right? It's because of things like this.
We're talking McLachlan's an anomaly, showing up at the 11th hour to the party thinking it's just getting started. But that's most people when they come to Canada. When I was working up north in the Yukon, we had a lot of American tourists coming through from Alaska or from other places in their big camper RVs. And oh my God, they were so surprised about everything. Or they would just be like, oh, where can I see the bears? It's I don't know. You got to go into the wilderness for that. They're not going to be just chilling everywhere. Okay, yeah, you get a bear on the side of the road occasionally. But it's not like we just kept them somewhere. They're not pets. This isn't a zoo.
I always operated under the assumption that Canada was one giant petting zoo. I mean, I have deer in my backyard all the time. Of course it's a giant petting zoo. That's not true, by the way, but
But yeah, it's a constant thing. McLachlan is a very good idea of that, of somebody coming into Canada thinking that they are Canadian, they know everything about Canada, but then asking where we keep the bears.
Oh yeah,
he's very touristy.
Yes,
he's a tourist.
I think the tourist imagery really, really works in well with what we're talking about in total today, right? This idea of being an agent, not only just with McLachlan, but just the principle of an agency encouraging people to come here. The imagery works on quite a few levels, right? And you're putting up a facade in order to attract these people to a certain extent, right? With the promise of work, with the promise of a better life. And to some extent it's true, but to another extent, it is a certain fantasy in a sense, right? There is an element of altering reality. There is an element of promising. And those promises don't always do have a grain of truth to them, but they don't always come, with the most honorable intentions in mind. And that's where you kind of get a lot of we talked positively about the Petworth project, but a lot of people do have a genuinely hard time coming here, right? And there is a price to their coming here. So I think that that's a very apt metaphor, is tourism. What I want to kind of finish off with, if you accept, Mr. Cooper, just going off of this last idea of the cost of, or at least the price of these immigrants, right? So first of all, we've mentioned it earlier that we had a very specific type of immigrant in mind, right? As Lieutenant Governor John Colborne represented, it was specifically British people that we wanted. And as you pointed out, Mackenzie, this conception of the native person was extremely jaded in some ways, right? This idea going in of like, oh wow, they're actually decent people. Who knew? And McLachlan completely ignoring them, right, or barely touching upon them in his poems. It's kind of a fascinating thing to realize, but also one that intrinsically leads us directly into our next episode, which is not a part 2 per se, but is a direct continuation of what we are talking about now.
Tangentially related, It's like, you have the Iron Man movies, and that's like this, and now we're going to do the Captain America movies, where we talk about the treaties.
In less of an entertaining fashion, but yes. The underlying problem that I wanted to mention here is that we didn't really mention it overviewing the Petworth immigration scheme, but a lot of the people were passed through Toronto through what were called companies, right? And specifically in Toronto, they had the Canada Company, which was a private company that actively sought to settle and expand land in Upper Canada, right? And so that land has to come from somewhere, right? Someone has to buy it off of another or take it off of another. And this mentality of only keeping the British also has its downfalls, right? And this kind of, as you mentioned, Mackenzie, leads us into a discussion of the treaties, because these treaties are specifically meant to move a people or peoples from land in order to accommodate the people that we've been talking about today. And that's an unfortunate side of the coin that we must address. And so our literature and history is going to be the same thing, much like we did with Durham, right? It's going to be treaties. It's going to be government papers, because that are absolutely essential to understanding Canada today.
The treaties stand as one of the most controversial documents ever created in Canadian history.
Absolutely. And we can't cover all of them, but we're certainly going to cover some of them in order to really make the point of what this means for everyone. Yeah, that being said, it's going to be a rough episode, but I think it's going to be it's
going to be an important one.
Yes, absolutely. Is there anything that you wanted to wrap up with, or can we kind of close the show?
Let's sew it up.
All right, cool. So as always, thanks everyone for listening. You can reach out with questions, comments, concerns through Facebook, Twitter. We've actually been growing a lot on Facebook. I should post more and I don't, but that's something that we could do.
Post more and I don't. We're English Lit and history students. We don't know social media.
We're not the social media intern at insert big company. I don't know.
All of them.
Oh. No, but you can reach out to us through all of them. All the links are going to be in the description below. You can support the show through PayPal donations or through the affiliate links in the recommended reading page that I set up. And basically, you'll find books that we talk about on the show. Also, and this is really the big one, you can support the show through Patreon. If you're interested, you can find perks like extra episodes, shout outs, and you can even recommend future episodes. All this is optional, and the show will still remain free and independent if you don't want to do any of that and just enjoy the show. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes and share it with some friends, it would be very appreciated. It legitimately helps to boost the show. That being said, Mac cut out because his internet apparently sucks. So I'll just wish you all excellent health, and I hope that everyone is doing absolutely fantastic these days, despite the circumstances. We'll see you all next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.